The American Revolution didn't begin with muskets. It began with rage. Ordinary colonists, farmers, merchants, craftsmen were fed up with being treated like subjects instead of citizens. They lived thousands of miles from Britain, yet every law, every tax, every restriction came from a parliament they had no voice in. And that silence was deafening. At first, the frustration simmered quietly. Britain saw the colonies as a source of wealth, pumping resources and taxes back to the crown. But for the colonists, every new rule felt like another chain being fastened. The resentment wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. Then came the French and Indian War. Britain had spent a fortune defending the colonies, and now it wanted repayment. Parliament rolled out tax after tax, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. Even everyday items like newspapers and playing cards carried new costs. To London, it was fair. To the colonies, it was tyranny. This is where the first flames appeared. Across taverns and town squares, people asked, why should we pay into a system that gives us nothing in return? The answer wasn't just political. It was emotional. Colonists were raising families, building towns, risking their lives on the frontier. Yet their future could be erased with a single vote in a government an ocean away. And then came the blood. In 1770, British soldiers clashed with a crowd in Boston. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow, the Boston Massacre. Word spread like lightning. Redcoats had killed unarmed men. Suddenly, anger turned into unity. The idea of rebellion no longer belonged to radicals. It belonged to the people. 3 years later, the fire erupted into open defiance. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about tea. It was about principle. Colonists disguised as Native Americans stormed British ships and dumped hundreds of chests into the harbor. The message was clear: we will not be controlled. Britain responded with fury, sending more troops, closing Boston Harbor, tightening its grip. But it only made the colonies bolder. This wasn't about commerce anymore. It wasn't even about taxes. It was about freedom itself. By 1774, the spark had become ablaze. Colonists were no longer just resisting laws. They were preparing to break away from the empire that ruled them. The fire of revolution had been lit, and nothing could put it out. No taxation without representation wasn't just a slogan. It was a roar, a thunderclap echoing through the colonies. And it cut straight to the heart of why ordinary men and women were willing to risk everything against the most powerful empire on earth. The colonists weren't against taxes themselves. They understood governments needed money. But what they hated, what they couldn't stomach, was being taxed by a parliament in London where they had no seat, no voice, no influence. They were paying into a system designed to control them, not protect them. Think of it this way. Imagine being charged money every day by a government that doesn't let you vote, doesn't listen to your concerns, and doesn't care if your family starves. That's how colonists felt every time another tax was stamped onto their lives. The Stamp Act of 1765 hit like a hammer. Suddenly, every legal document, every license, even newspapers carried a tax stamp. It wasn't just expensive, it was insulting. To Americans, it screamed, "You're not equals. You're subjects." Resistance spread like wildfire. Merchants boycotted British goods. Town meetings raged with anger. Colonial newspapers printed fiery essays that mocked British officials. It wasn't just protest, it was awakening. People who had never spoken about politics were suddenly talking about freedom. Then came the Townshend Acts. Taxes on glass, paint, paper, and tea. Everyday essentials. This wasn't just Parliament looking for money, it was Parliament testing control. Could the colonies be pushed further? Could they be squeezed harder without snapping? The answer was no. Colonists fought back with boycotts, so powerful they crippled British trade. Women, who rarely had a political voice at the time, became central to the resistance. They wove their own cloth, brewed their own tea substitutes, and proudly declared they would never rely on Britain again. Freedom was no longer just an idea, it was entering daily life. But Britain didn't back down. They doubled down. Soldiers were stationed in colonial towns to enforce the laws. Red uniforms patrolled the streets of Boston, muskets in hand, a constant reminder, obey or pay the price. And that's what made no taxation without representation more than just words. It was a line in the sand, a declaration that the colonies were done being treated like subjects, done funding an empire that gave them nothing in return. The phrase united farmers, merchants, and intellectuals. It turned scattered frustrations into a common identity. Colonists weren't just Virginians or Bostonians or Pennsylvanians anymore. They were Americans, and they were ready to fight for a voice or die trying. The protests couldn't last forever. Words, boycotts, and petitions had their power, but sooner or later, muskets would speak louder than speeches. The turning point came in April 1775 in two small towns outside Boston, Lexington and Concord. British troops had been ordered to seize colonial weapons hidden in Concord, but word spread fast. Thanks to writers like Paul Revere, militias were already gathering. The morning was tense. Farmers turned soldiers stood on the Lexington Green, staring down rows of redcoats. No one knows who fired the first shot, but history calls it the shot heard round the world. In an instant, the revolution began. Gunpowder cracked, smoke filled the air, and the first American blood was spilled in open defiance of the crown. The British thought they could crush the rebellion quickly. But on their retreat from Concord back to Boston, colonial militias lined the roads, firing from trees and stone walls. What should have been a simple mission turned into chaos. The empire had been challenged and embarrassed. From that day forward, there was no going back. Protests had transformed into war. The colonies moved fast. Militias became armies. Farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths laid down their tools and picked up muskets. They weren't professional soldiers, but they had something stronger, belief. A conviction that this fight wasn't just for land or taxes. It was for liberty itself. In June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill sent another shockwave. British troops charged up the hill again and again, suffering massive losses. Though the colonists eventually retreated, the message was clear. This wasn't going to be an easy victory for Britain. Meanwhile, leaders like George Washington were stepping into the spotlight. Washington, tall, disciplined, and relentless, took command of the Continental Army. He wasn't leading the best-trained soldiers in the world, but he was leading men who were ready to fight for their homes, their families, their future. The protests of the past, tea dumped in harbors, boycotts of British goods, had transformed into something larger. This was now a full-scale struggle between an empire and a people determined to be free. And yet, at this point, not everyone agreed on independence. Some colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They wanted fair treatment, not total separation. But Britain's response, the crackdowns, the soldiers, the arrogance of Parliament, pushed more and more people to realize, we can't go back. We have to break free. By 1776, that idea exploded into history's most famous document, the Declaration of Independence. But before that declaration could mean anything, it had to be defended on the battlefield. The protests had ended. The war had begun. The early years of the war were brutal. The colonists had passion, but passion doesn't stop bullets. Britain had the best-trained army in the world, the strongest navy, and endless resources. Washington's army? Poorly supplied, barely trained, often barefoot, and constantly on the edge of collapse. In 1776, the British nearly crushed the revolution in New York. Washington's troops were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, forced into desperate retreats. Morale was sinking. Soldiers deserted. Some wondered if the revolution was already doomed. But here's where history turned. Washington refused to let the fire die. On Christmas night, 1776, in freezing snow and ice, he led a daring attack across the Delaware River. His men surprised the Hessian forces at Trenton and captured hundreds. It wasn't the biggest battle, but it was a miracle when the revolution needed one most. It proved that this ragtag army could win, and hope returned. The real turning point, though, came at Saratoga in 1777. British General Burgoyne planned to cut the colonies in half by marching south from Canada. But American forces surrounded him. After weeks of fighting, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. It was a massive victory, and the world noticed. Suddenly, France, Britain's old enemy, saw the Americans as more than rebels. They saw them as a cause worth backing. French ships, French troops, French money, all of it began flowing into the revolution. Soon, Spain and the Netherlands followed. What began as a local uprising had now exploded into a global war. Britain wasn't just fighting farmers anymore. They were fighting a coalition of nations. But victories came with sacrifice. The winter at Valley Forge, 1777–78, nearly broke Washington's army. Men froze without shoes, starved without food, and suffered from disease. Yet instead of collapsing, the army transformed. With the help of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, Washington's ragged soldiers trained into a disciplined fighting force. Out of misery was born resilience. The revolution wasn't easy, wasn't clean, and wasn't certain. For every Trenton, there was a crushing defeat. For every Saratoga, there was another retreat. But what mattered was endurance. Washington understood something Britain didn't. He didn't have to win every battle. He only had to keep the army alive, keep the spirit alive, until Britain grew tired of bleeding. And that moment came in 1781 at Yorktown. With French ships blocking the sea and American troops surrounding the land, General Cornwallis had no escape. His surrender shattered Britain's will to continue. The greatest empire in the world had been beaten by a people it once dismissed as unruly colonists. The revolution had turned. What started as protests in the streets of Boston ended with armies kneeling at surrender fields. The impossible had become reality. The guns fell silent in 1781, but the revolution wasn't just about winning battles. It was about creating something brand new, an identity, a nation, a future that had never existed before. When General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Britain still technically had the world's strongest military. But the will to fight was gone. The war had drained their treasury, stretched their forces thin, and embarrassed their pride. Across the Atlantic, the colonies celebrated, but victory wasn't official until 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. That treaty did something extraordinary. It recognized the United States of America as free and independent. Stop and think about that for a moment. Just 8 years earlier, these same people were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants living under the rule of a distant king. Now, they were citizens of a nation built on an idea, liberty. But freedom came with challenges. Independence didn't erase divisions. The new nation had to figure out how to govern itself. No king, no parliament, just 13 colonies trying to unite as one. It was messy, uncertain, and fragile. Yet, through debates, compromises, and determination, a new system was born, one that would later be cemented in the Constitution. What made the American Revolution so powerful wasn't just that it broke Britain's chains. It was that it inspired the world. Across Europe, in South America, even in France, people looked at America and thought, if they can fight for freedom, so can we. The revolution was a spark that set fire to global movements for democracy. And at its heart, it was always more than muskets and battles. It was about ordinary people daring to believe that they deserved a voice, that they could shape their destiny, that no empire, no king, no foreign power could take away their right to stand free. The American Revolution wasn't perfect. It left contradictions, slavery, inequality, divisions that would take centuries to confront. But it planted a seed of self-determination, of courage, of hope. And that seed grew into the United States, the nation that began as 13 colonies and transformed into a symbol of possibility. So when we look back at those 10 years of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph, the lesson is clear. Freedom isn't given. It's fought for. And once it's won, It has the power to change the world.